I never thought this day would come. For 50 years I stood beside him, and now inside 4 minutes, everything I fought for has been taken from me. The chamber had been sealed for a formal announcement, but nobody inside that room was prepared for what followed the reading of the decision. Catherine's name had been placed against the title Camilla believed defined her entire standing beside the crown. And in less than 4 minutes, ceremony collapsed into confusion. A glass tipped. Charles lowered his eyes. William reached toward his wife. Then Camilla dropped forward against the polished table, turning a private constitutional session into the most personal royal breakdown seen in a generation. Before we go any deeper into what this really means for the future of the monarchy, take 1 second to subscribe so you never miss another royal update like this. Charles knew before anyone else in that chamber how quickly the room could turn against him. The Privy Council, a formal body of senior advisors that assists the sovereign on certain state and constitutional matters, had been called for a decision that could not be undone once spoken aloud. William sat across from his father with a stillness that felt rehearsed. Catherine kept her hands folded on the table, refusing to look up. Camilla, seated closer to the king than anyone, still believed the meeting concerned ceremonial adjustments, nothing more. The announcement arrived without a single softening phrase. Catherine would be granted the elevated queen title with its full ceremonial standing, displacing Camilla from the position she had spent 2 decades quietly defending. The title carried recognition, precedence, and the public place beside the monarch that she had endured years of hostility to secure. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Camilla's hand slid across the table, searching for Charles. Charles did not move. She tried to rise as the final sentence was read. Her lips shaped his name once, then again, but her balance failed before a third attempt could form. The queen consort dropped sideways against her chair, and the king moved a second too late. William was already on his feet. Catherine stood without knowing what to do with her hands. Fear moved through the chamber, but something colder cut beneath it. Charles had not objected. Charles had not interrupted. Charles had not requested a delay before his own wife walked into that room unprepared. William saw the silence before anyone else understood its shape. His father's face carried shock without surprise, and that small difference landed like a verdict. As aides moved toward Camilla, Catherine glanced downward and saw a sealed supplementary page tucked beneath the main decision document. An advisor gathered the papers quickly, but not quickly enough. Catherine had already understood that her new title was only the visible part of what had been prepared. The door closed behind Camilla as she was carried away. William turned toward Charles and no longer thought about the collapse alone. If the king had known what was coming, why had he allowed her to walk into that chamber without a single warning? Her fall had ended the meeting, but inside the family it had opened a far more dangerous question. What had this title meant to each of them before it was ever taken away? For Catherine, the announcement did not feel like reward. For Camilla, it felt like the destruction of a lifetime of quiet endurance. And between them stood Charles and William, 2 men bound by blood yet suddenly forced to defend 2 entirely different futures. The title had sounded ceremonial when spoken across the council table, but behind those syllables lived decades of scandal, rehabilitation, patience, grief, and expectation. Every person inside that room understood exactly how much had just been transferred from one woman to another. Camilla had believed her position beside Charles had finally become untouchable. The Queen Consort title had never been simply an honorific to her, it had been proof that the country had accepted what had once been unthinkable. For her, losing it meant reopening every wound the monarchy had spent 20 years attempting to close. Catherine carried the opposite burden. As William's wife and the future queen tied to the next generation of the crown, she knew every promotion would attract heavier scrutiny, sharper comparisons, and expectations she had never publicly requested. Catherine returned to her private apartment, carrying none of the composure the outside world expected. She removed her earrings slowly, placed them beside a small framed photograph, and remained motionless long after the room had fallen quiet. William found her staring at the wall. When he asked what she was thinking, she answered quietly that she had never wanted her elevation to arrive through another woman's public humiliation. William understood immediately. He had asked for clarity, structure, and a defined future for their household. He had never asked for this. Camilla woke in her private chamber with only one question forming in her mind. She asked the aide beside her whether Charles had objected during the meeting. The pause that followed told her everything a longer answer would have hidden. When the king finally arrived to see her, she studied his face before speaking, then asked when he had first seen Catherine's name against the decision. He tried to reassure her before answering. That hesitation cut deeper than the collapse itself. Charles spoke about continuity, stability, and the need to avoid a wider family conflict. But the Queen heard only the words he refused to say. Somewhere before that council meeting, the machinery of the decision had already been moving. She had simply been the last person expected to notice it. William carried that same suspicion back to Catherine. He told her privately that the council action had clearly been developing for weeks, not days. Somebody had prepared a transfer of position long before the final announcement. And his father's silence during the collapse now looked less like shock and more like the quiet weight of prior knowledge. That realization changed everything for both of them. Because the answer to what had happened inside that chamber did not begin at the council table at all. It began months earlier, during a small, private gathering where one bitter exchange forced Charles to confront a decision he had been avoiding for far too long. And once that moment happened, no path back remained. The collapse did not begin at the Privy Council. Its true beginning traced back to a private reception at Sandringham that should have ended without incident. Instead, one confrontation shattered the delicate balance between Camilla, Catherine, William, and Charles. No cameras recorded that evening. No journalists learned of the argument. Yet that confrontation became the moment the king stopped asking whether change was necessary and began deciding how far it would be allowed to go. William had been pressing for greater clarity long before the crisis exploded. He believed the next generation could no longer keep appearing publicly while remaining uncertain privately about who represented the monarchy at its most important occasions. Ceremonial precedence, the formal order determining where senior royals stand, sit, and appear at official state events, had become more than protocol. It had become a visible measure of influence inside the family itself. Charles tried to keep that concern separate from personal emotion. He was convinced that Camilla's established position and Catherine's expanding role could coexist without conflict. Catherine felt the strain growing regardless. She wanted to honor the monarch and avoid appearing ambitious. Yet William increasingly argued that endless ambiguity was weakening them both in the eyes of the country. Camilla sensed the same shift from the opposite direction. Every new responsibility given to the younger couple began to feel less like ordinary succession planning and more like another piece of her standing being quietly withdrawn. She had fought too long, endured too much criticism, and rebuilt her public image too carefully to lose it without resistance. The confrontation happened after a reception at Sandringham. A revised seating arrangement for an upcoming state banquet had placed Catherine in a position that noticeably altered the balance between the two women. Camilla found the amended card first. She approached Catherine with Charles standing close enough to hear every word and said quietly, "Future status does not outrank the present queen." Catherine did not raise her voice. She replied that she had never requested the change and had never intended to embarrass anyone. William entered before the tension could dissipate. He heard enough of the exchange to understand what had just occurred, and he refused to allow the moment to be dismissed as another polite misunderstanding. The prince told his father directly that uncertainty was now damaging everyone. If the monarchy intended to shift responsibility toward the future, he argued, then the family needed one clear structure, rather than constant silent battles over every ceremony. Charles remained almost completely quiet through the exchange. After the others left the room, he picked up the revised seating card, folded it once along its length, and held it between his fingers for several long seconds. Then he turned toward a senior advisor and gave only 3 words: "Prepare the options." That instruction meant possible formal arrangements for redistributing titles, duties, and ceremonial standing would now be examined rather than merely discussed in private. Camilla never learned of those 3 words that night. She would understand them only after her collapse, when the timeline finally became impossible to deny. Charles had not simply watched events unfold. He had been quietly authorizing the transition for months. And once Camilla understood that his silence at Sandringham had been the true beginning of the decision, her grief hardened into something far more dangerous than tears. She wanted him to answer for it, face to face, without advisors, without protocol. Camilla had survived public judgment before, but this betrayal had come from inside the marriage itself. Hours after leaving the council session, she demanded one answer from Charles, and this time no palace protocol could shelter him from her question. The question was brutally simple. Did he know? When the king failed to answer immediately, she understood. What followed was not a discussion between senior royals. It was a wounded wife confronting the husband she believed had allowed her humiliation to unfold in silence. Camilla entered the private sitting room, holding a briefing page she had obtained after the meeting. She already knew that discussions about Catherine's elevation had accelerated after Sandringham, and she already knew that Charles had received more than one paper long before the final decision reached the chamber. A briefing paper is simply a formal document setting out options, risks, and recommended actions. But to her, that page had become something painfully personal. He had been warned. She had been kept outside the truth. She placed the page between them and looked directly at her husband. "You knew before I walked into that room, didn't you?" Charles did not answer immediately. That pause became the answer. She repeated the question, quieter this time, and the king finally admitted he had known the discussions were advanced. He insisted he had hoped to prevent the family from tearing itself apart in public. But she heard only that peace had mattered more to him than warning her. Charles tried to explain the choice he believed he had faced. Protecting his wife's existing position risked delaying the transition toward William and Catherine. The couple increasingly expected to carry the monarchy's future. Yet moving too quickly threatened his marriage. He had convinced himself there was still time to manage both directions at once. Camilla stared at him and told him plainly that managing her was not the same as respecting her. Charles finally admitted something harder. After the Sandringham confrontation, he had approved a formal examination of Catherine's future status. He claimed the final mechanism had gone further than the options he first authorized. But Camilla did not soften. The decision had not appeared from nowhere. His signature had opened the door. Then she mentioned the sealed supplementary page. She told him she had seen the reference before the papers were removed and demanded to know what else was being transferred alongside the title. Charles's expression shifted before he answered. That reaction alone told her the truth was larger than the ceremony. The hidden page dealt with far more than titles. It outlined which royal household would take control of duties, patronages, communications, and access that had once protected Camilla's daily influence. The title had wounded her personally, but now she understood the deeper threat. This was no longer about what she would be called at state banquets. It was about who would hold operational power once the palace doors closed. Titles capture headlines, but real power hides in smaller sentences. Beneath the dramatic announcement sat a second decision involving patronage transfer, ceremonial authority, household coordination, and access to the machinery surrounding the crown itself. Suddenly, Camilla's fear made complete sense. Catherine was not simply being granted a more formal manner of address. A new center of gravity was being constructed around William, and Charles was being forced to decide whether the monarchy's future required him to weaken the person closest to him. Charles understood exactly what the supplementary arrangement would do. It moved selected ceremonial planning and major public representation toward William and Catherine, granting their household greater authority over how the monarchy would present its next chapter. Household coordinations determines which royal office manages schedules, appearances, and important state duties. That matters because influence inside the family almost always follows responsibility. The king knew this was no longer symbolic. Once those functions moved, authority would follow them. Charles sat alone with the final page and rotated a pen between his fingers again and again. An aide entered, waited for an instruction, then withdrew silently when none came. The monarch glanced toward a small photograph of Camilla before returning his eyes to Catherine's name on the document. Advisors had described the change as essential for institutional continuity, but no paper could erase the human cost. His acceptance would make the transition feel legitimate. His refusal would reopen the entire struggle. William felt none of the triumph others expected him to feel. He told Catherine privately that gaining greater authority through family suffering could strengthen the institution while damaging every person inside it. She agreed without hesitation. The future king had wanted defined responsibility for years, but this was different. He could already see how easily renewal could begin to resemble punishment if Camilla was stripped of influence too rapidly. Charles finally spoke to his son without advisors present. He admitted he had deliberately kept Camilla outside the final stages because he feared she would force him to choose openly between his marriage and succession planning. The king said he had hoped to settle the structure before emotion could overwhelm the decision. William heard something far more revealing beneath the explanation. His father had already made the choice. He had simply made it in private, where nobody could see the cost. The council had not created the division. The council had merely exposed a decision that already existed beneath the surface. That truth became impossible to conceal almost immediately. Camilla received notice that a royal engagement she had expected to lead was being reassigned to Catherine. No one had consulted her. No one had even warned her. The documents had spoken in careful institutional language. Now the palace calendar was about to translate that language into laws, one crossed-out duty at a time. The real impact arrived not with another proclamation, but with a quietly changed diary. One engagement disappeared. Another meeting was moved. Correspondence that once arrived directly now passed through different offices. Camilla had survived the shock of losing the title. But this was different. This was the moment she could watch her practical influence vanish appointment by appointment. And when Catherine's name appeared beside an event Camilla had personally expected to open, the new reality became impossible to dismiss any longer. Camilla read the updated engagement sheet twice before placing it face down on the desk. The changes were small on paper but enormous in meaning. Ceremonial precedence, the formal order determining who takes priority at official royal occasions, was now being reflected inside schedules, representation, and access. Duties once coordinated through her office were shifting toward William and Catherine's household. The council decision was no longer trapped inside formal language. It had entered the daily machinery of royal life. Camilla kept her voice controlled when a long-serving aide asked whether she wanted the reassignment challenged. She looked back at the page and answered only, "No, I want to know who approved it." The queen had already lost a title. Now she wanted to discover whether the person removing her practical influence was the same husband who had claimed the final arrangement had gone further than he expected. Catherine learned about the change from her own staff and immediately felt uneasy. Several people around her treated the new responsibility as evidence that her elevation was already taking effect. But she refused to allow the moment to become a private celebration. She told her team clearly that no one was to speak dismissively about Camilla or treat the transition as a personal victory. The younger royal understood something the palace had forgotten. Authority gained through humiliation would poison everything it was meant to strengthen. Camilla received the answer she had feared. The approval trail led directly back to Charles. He had personally allowed the reassignment to proceed. That realization landed harder than the document itself because it destroyed the last comforting explanation available to her. The king was not merely tolerating the transition. He was actively implementing it, quietly, deliberately, without her knowledge. William reacted with visible anger when he learned how rapidly the changes were being executed. He confronted his father and warned that stripping responsibilities away too quickly would make the transition appear punitive rather than necessary. The prince had pushed for clarity, but he had never asked for a public dismantling of Camilla's role. Charles did not defend the pace. Instead, he told his son to meet him privately that evening. No secretary, no advisor, no briefing paper. That instruction changed the temperature in the palace immediately. With the machinery of monarchy finally stripped away, Father and son were about to face the one conversation neither institution nor protocol could soften. For once, there were no officials to translate their words and no ceremonial language available to hide behind. Charles and William would sit together not as king and heir, but as father and son. Charles spoke first, and this time he did not retreat behind procedure. He admitted he had spent too long trying to preserve two realities at the same moment: Camilla's established place beside him, and the growing demand for William and Catherine to become unmistakably central to the monarchy's future. That future mattered because the public increasingly looked to the younger couple for continuity. While the existing structure still carried emotional promises he had made years earlier, the king had tried to protect both worlds. Instead, he had allowed them to collide. William did not exempt himself from responsibility. He acknowledged that after Sandringham he had pushed hard for clarity, and had demanded the uncertainty surrounding roles finally end. But the prince insisted he had never requested Camilla be humiliated, stripped of dignity, or made to feel her years of service had suddenly lost value. He had asked for change. He had never asked for cruelty. Charles lowered his voice. "I thought delay was kindness," William answered without pausing. It only made the decision feel like betrayal. Neither man raised his voice through the entire conversation. That restraint made the exchange heavier, not lighter. The future king understood his father had not acted from malice. The monarch understood good intentions no longer erased the damage. William then asked the question cutting through everything else. Did his father still love Camilla enough to repair what silence had broken? Charles answered immediately that he did. And for the first time he separated his marriage completely from the institutional decision. The structural change would stand. But that did not mean his wife had to be erased from his life or from meaningful public service. Charles revealed he intended to speak directly with Camilla and offer her a clearly defined personal and charitable role, one focused on causes she had built patiently across 2 decades. It would not restore the old arrangement, but it would make one truth absolutely clear. Transition did not have to mean rejection. William made his own decision. Catherine would accept the elevated position, but their household would never celebrate at Camilla's expense, and no member of their staff would be permitted to treat the shift as a personal triumph. That private understanding might have steadied the family. But before either man could shape the message, news of the council decision escaped the palace walls. By sunrise, the country was staring at the headline they had desperately hoped to control. By morning, what had begun behind closed palace doors belonged to everyone. The private argument over succession, loyalty, marriage, and monarchy exploded across television screens and front pages, reducing months of quiet tension into one unforgettable image. Camilla collapsing as Catherine's new status was read aloud. Yet outside the palace gates, the reaction was not simple celebration or outrage. It became a national argument over compassion, renewal, and whether royal duty could ever be separated from the human beings forced to carry it. Catherine watched the morning coverage beside William and felt the weight of every headline. Some commentators described her elevation as a clean generational shift, evidence that the monarchy was finally preparing itself for the future. Others focused almost entirely on Camilla's collapse and the perceived cruelty surrounding it. Palace communications attempted to hold a careful middle line, emphasizing continuity and dignity, without positioning either woman as victor or victim. That balance mattered enormously. Any hint of celebration could turn a family transition into a public feud lasting years. Catherine became visibly uncomfortable when one broadcaster described her as having won. She turned toward William and told him there was no victory in watching another member of the family collapse in public. The prince agreed. He had fought for clearer responsibility, but the story had already moved beyond titles and duties. Public sympathy could easily harden into resentment if the country believed the younger couple had benefited from another woman's suffering. Camilla refused to watch any of the television coverage. She wanted distance from the voices analyzing her marriage, her health, and the moment her strength had failed in front of everyone who mattered. But a newspaper left outside her private room dragged the story back into her hands. She paused at Catherine's photograph on the front page, studied it for a long moment, then turned the paper face down. The Queen could avoid the broadcast, but she could not escape what the country now believed had happened to her. Crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace throughout the morning, as broadcasters delivered rolling updates. One newspaper carried the enormous headline, "A New Queen Era," above contrasting photographs of Catherine standing composed beside William and Camilla being helped from the chamber. Yet the people outside did not divide neatly into opposing camps. Some welcomed the younger royal's rise. Others spoke openly about the cruelty of watching an older woman lose her position so publicly and so suddenly. Charles followed that reaction more closely than anyone expected him to. The king realized the public was fully capable of accepting Catherine's new position without demanding Camilla's humiliation as its price. And that quiet realization gave him the opening he needed. He could preserve the transition while still protecting his wife from being treated as disposable by the very institution she had spent 20 years defending. That realization forced one final decision. The country had already delivered its emotional verdict. Now Charles had to deliver his own and decide what dignity would look like after the crown had begun to change hands. In the end, the defining moment was not Camilla's collapse or even Catherine's elevation. It was what happened after everyone finally stopped fighting the reality standing in front of them. Charles could not reverse the decision without reopening the uncertainty he had finally chosen to end. William could not build the future by pretending the past held no meaning. Catherine could not accept greater responsibility while treating another woman's pain as her triumph. And Camilla had to decide who she was without the title that had defined 2 decades of her public life. Catherine formally accepted the elevated queen title, and with it came a clearer place beside William, inside the monarchy's forward-facing structure. The designation represented the formal position held beside the sovereign, but its deeper meaning now rested in responsibility rather than triumph. The prince understood that their rise would be judged not by what authority they collected, but by how carefully they chose to carry it. Camilla, meanwhile, retained a respected place beside Charles and continued with the charitable commitments that still gave real purpose to her public service. Charles finally met his wife without briefing papers, without advisors, and without carefully prepared institutional language between them. He told Camilla he should have warned her before the council session. She listened, then answered with painful simplicity. Losing the title had wounded her, but discovering that he had known and remained silent had hurt her far more. The king did not argue. He did not defend the decision. For once, he simply accepted the damage his silence had caused. Catherine chose a quieter response. She wrote Camilla a personal note by hand, acknowledging the painful circumstances surrounding the change and making it clear that she did not regard another woman's humiliation as her own victory. The queen read the note twice. She could have discarded it. Instead, she placed it carefully beside a small photograph on her dressing table. A small gesture that showed anger had not entirely defeated dignity. William made his position clear to Catherine one final time. Their new authority would never be used to publicly diminish the generation who had carried the monarchy before them. The future king wanted succession to look like responsibility, not revenge. And she agreed completely. Their advancement would stand, but it would never require pretending everything before them had been a mistake. Camilla made the hardest choice of all. She decided not to contest the arrangement. Her victory was no longer about recovering what had been taken from her. It was about refusing to allow one title to define her marriage, her service, or the years she had already given to a family that had once refused to accept her at all. The monarchy emerged altered but intact. Catherine represented what came next. Camilla carried the painful cost of accepting that change. William accepted the full weight of leadership, while Charles finally understood that delaying a difficult truth could wound the people around him far more deeply than speaking it honestly ever would. And so the moment that began with a collapse ended not with another battle, but with quiet acceptance. The crown moved toward Catherine. Camilla stepped into a different kind of place beside the king she still loved. Charles faced the private cost of his own silence. And the monarchy survived because everyone finally accepted that the future could never arrive without first changing the present. Thanks so much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.